The Galactic Council did not notice the human smiling. The chair was too high for the desk. The desk was too far from the center. And no one had thought to fix either of those things before I walked into the chamber for the first time. That was the first thing I noticed when I entered the great convocation hall of the Galactic Council. Not the building itself, though it was honestly breathtaking. Not the 47 alien species seated in a vast curved line of raised platforms, each one representing a civilization that had been traveling between stars while my ancestors were still learning how to shape stone into tools. Not even the soft layered sound of dozens of translation systems working at once, each trying to turn completely different kinds of speech into something the rest of us could understand. No, the first thing I noticed was that my chair was wrong. My name is Daravos. I am 31 years old. I was born in a mid-sized city in the north of England. I studied political science at a university most people outside my country would never recognize. After that, I spent 6 years working in interplanetary resource law, which sounds much grander than it felt when I was doing it. Mostly, it meant long documents, difficult negotiations, and arguments over who technically had the right to dig up what from which moon. Then one day, the government called me and told me, in a voice so calm it almost felt insulting, that I had been selected as Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council. They said it like they were offering me a seat on a local policy board in a ceremony. No grand speech, no moment of history, just a call. Later, I found out I had not been the first person they asked, or the second, or the third. Possibly not even the fourth. The first choice turned it down. The second had a medical problem. The third, according to the official record, experienced a severe stress response. According to the unofficial version, he locked himself inside his flat for 2 weeks and stopped answering his phone. That'd be why the time they got to me, Earth had only 4 days left before the council's deadline to submit official credentials. I said yes before they had fully finished asking. That was 6 weeks before I walked into the convocation hall and realized my chair was too high for my desk. The hall itself was enormous in a way that almost made scale feel meaningless. It was carved from a dark mineral that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. The walls rose upward in long, smooth curves toward a ceiling so distant it almost did not seem connected to the room below. There were clouds near the top, actual clouds. When I first saw them, I thought I was imagining things, but no. There was a thin layer of vapor hanging high above the upper arches, drifting slowly through the air like the room had its own weather. The council had been meeting in that chamber for roughly 4,000 years. IT had not been built for people like me. The largest platform belonged to the Veth delegation. Their representative, Councillor Breath, stood somewhere between 3 and 4 meters tall, with 4 arms and a broad, heavy frame that suggested his species had evolved under much stronger gravity than Earth's. Even at rest, he looked like something built for war and then forced into diplomacy by history. Across from him, barely visible from where I sat, were the Oronisi. They looked like pale, long-bodied insects, delicate and unsettling, with thin folded wings that shimmered when they moved. They communicated by changing the vibrations of those wings. My translator turned the sound into a dry, clipped whisper in my ear. There were 47 non-human species in that room. Before leaving Earth, I had memorized every single one, not just their names and home systems, but their histories, political structures, trade agreements, voting patterns, military conflicts, cultural taboos, old rivalries, current alliances, and the sections of council law that shaped their standing inside the chamber. But I had also memorized the entire council charter, all 10,000 pages of it. Not only the main body, but the appendices, amendment notes, procedural revisions, and the historical annotations that most sane people would never willingly read. That I did it in one night. This is not a boast. It is simply what happened. I had decided that if I was going to walk into a room where everyone else had a 1,000-year lead on me, then I was not going to arrive unprepared. And no one knew that, and no one cared enough to ask. Most of the ambassadors barely looked at me at all. Councillor Breath, the Veth ambassador, was the one who had pushed Earth's admission through. He had needed a 48 vote to settle a procedural deadlock around a resource matter, and Earth had been the easiest candidate world to contact fast enough to be useful. Our membership had been approved in under 6 hours. There had been little debate. From what I could tell, The general feeling in the chamber was that Earth had been admitted not because anyone truly wanted us there, but because we were convenient, a temporary solution, a spare number. Something to be dealt with later. Breath barely glanced at me when I took my seat. He was already speaking with the Solon ambassador, a tall silver-skinned being whose species spoke in layered musical tones. The translation system always made the Solon sound faintly amused, even when they were discussing something serious. I noticed that 2.my seat was placed in the outermost arc of the chamber, at the very edge of the crescent, as far from the central podium as it was possible to be, while still technically being part of the room. The earpiece I had been issued was an older model. Not broken exactly, but old enough that it sometimes dropped syllables and lagged half a breath behind the speaker. It had been handed to me without apology, as though it were standard that I put it in and said nothing. The session began. A Veth administrator opened the proceedings in a language my earpiece translated with a faint electrical buzz under every sentence. There were 12 items on the agenda. I had read advanced material for 11 of them. The 12th had been added that morning and concerned a small territorial adjustment in a sector I knew fairly well from my years in resource law, that I did not speak, that I listened, I watched. And somewhere in the second hour, while the chamber moved through the slow ritual of ancient procedure, a strange feeling settled over me. Not fear, though I was afraid. Not awe, though there was plenty of that too. Not even the sharp, dizzy feeling of being out of place, which was certainly there. This was something else. Something quieter that IT took me a moment to name it. Possibility. Because once the first shock wore off, once the scale of the room stopped pressing on me quite so hard, I started seeing what was really in front of me, that I saw old powers moving in old patterns, that I saw alliances that had lasted so long they no longer needed trust to stay standing. Habit was enough that I saw the Veth and the Solon speaking past each other with the smooth, tired skill of rivals who had spent so many centuries disagreeing that they no longer truly listened, that I saw the smaller member worlds sitting in their own outer places, quiet and ignored, voting when called on, rarely consulted before decisions were made, that I saw a system that had been operating for 4,000 years on the same assumptions. And then I looked at myself. The wrong chair, the bad earpiece, the distant seat. The thick rulebook handed to me like a joke or a formality. No one expected anything from me. That was when I smiled. Not because I had some plan already finished. I did not. Not because I felt confident. I didn't. I smiled because for the first time since arriving, I understood the shape of the room. And once you understand the shape of a room, you start noticing where the cracks might be. Across the chamber, Counselor Breath was making a procedural motion. 47 civilizations were doing what they had always done in the way they had always done it, and O1 noticed the human smiling. As it turned out, that was exactly what I needed. For 3 months, I said almost nothing important on the council floor. This drove my government contact on Earth nearly insane. His name was Oliver Burke, a senior official in Earth's diplomatic service. Every 72 hours, almost exactly, he called me from a relay station near the edge of the heliopause to ask what progress I had made. Oliver believed in visible action. Speeches, statements, objections entered into the record. Public signs that Earth was not just present, but active. You need to be seen, he told me on what I counted as the 9th call. I'm seen, I said. I'm in the chamber at every session. That is not what I mean, Dart, I knew that. But Oliver was 4 light hours away, and I was the one actually sitting in the room. So I kept doing exactly what I've been doing. Watching. There's a difference between sitting quietly and paying attention. The same way, there is a difference between hearing words and actually listening to what is underneath them. I tracked everything. Every formal speech, every pause before a vote, every side conversation I could hear pieces of. Every small sign that a relationship everyone assumed was stable might not be quite as solid as it looked. The Veth and the Solon had a trade compact that was publicly presented as strong and cooperative. Privately, it was strained. The Solon had adjusted shipping lanes twice in the past decade in ways that quietly favored their own extraction interests and made life harder for Veth-controlled sectors. The Veth knew it. The Solon knew the Veth knew it. Both sides kept acting as though the agreement was fine because admitting the truth would cost too much. That kind of tension matters if a structure is carrying weight. then every crack inside it matters. The Oran Confederacy, a seat shared by 7 smaller species who had united centuries ago to survive politically, was showing signs of stress. 2 of the 7 had been locked in a quiet territorial disagreement for 60 years. You could see it in their voting record if you looked closely enough. Not in anything dramatic, just in small hesitations. Abstentions that made no sense if you only read the official explanation. The Oranisi, ancient and deeply respected, held one of the council's most powerful advisory roles. Nearly everyone spoke of them with respect. Almost no one truly trusted them. Their agreements had a strange pattern. People left the negotiation table with peace, yes, but also with a nagging feeling they had somehow given up slightly more than they meant to. And one could ever prove this. It was simply how the Oranisi operated that I wrote all of it down. Not on a secure network. Not in an official file in a paper notebook, a real one with a PEND handwriting so cramped and uneven that no one else would have read it easily even if they had taken it from me. The other thing I did was make friends. Not with the ambassadors, with everyone else. The Galactic Council met on Nexus Station, a giant structure that had grown so much over the centuries that its original design was buried under layer after layer of expansion. It held not only the chamber itself, but the entire support system behind 48 diplomatic missions. Thousands of workers kept the place running. Translators, archive staff, technicians, administrative personnel, maintenance crews, service workers. Most ambassadors barely spoke to any of them. I spoke to all of them. There was Priya in the archive, who had worked there for 9 years and knew exactly which historical files were original and which had been quietly revised over time. There was Cal in translation maintenance, who knew which ambassadors had upgraded earpieces and which ones had private settings that gave them slightly faster feeds than standard issue. There was Set, who worked in the station's administrative systems and had been there for 4 decades. Set was not human. Set communicated through patterns of light, which my earpiece translated into the patient voice of an elderly professor. Set knew everyone and remembered everything. None of them were invited to diplomatic receptions. None of them were asked for their thoughts by the people making decisions. That I was the first ambassador, as far as I could tell, who had ever treated them like they were part of the machine that mattered. They talked. Not recklessly, not stupidly, just honestly. I learned which votes had already been settled privately before they ever reached the floor. I learned which ambassador had a financial arrangement that should have been disclosed and had not been. I learned that the Veth were quietly speaking to 3 smaller member worlds ahead of a major future vote on extraction rights. Everything went in the notebook. Then one afternoon, in the 3rd month, sitting in the archive beside Priya, while she sorted old procedural files, I found it. The thing no one else had noticed, or maybe the thing no one else had bothered to read carefully enough to understand. The moment itself was not dramatic. That is true of most moments that actually change your life. They do not arrive with music. They do not announce themselves. They sit quietly in the middle of something ordinary and wait for someone to pay attention. Priya was showing me a set of original council documents that had been digitized long ago, but never fully indexed. No one had cared enough to organize them properly because they were considered historical material, not active law. That I was reading them because I read everything, half out of caution, half because once I started pulling on threads, I did not like leaving them alone. In the 3rd appendix of a supplementary amendment passed in the Council's early years, I found a clause called the Principle of Foundational Equity. The translation rendered the old legal language into something stiff but readable. The meaning was simple. Any world admitted to the Council on a probationary basis, if it completed 3 full Council cycles without a recorded procedural violation, could claim full voting rights retroactive to the date of original admission. That I read the clause once, then again, then a 3rd time. 3 full cycles. Each cycle was roughly 1 Earth year. Earth had been admitted 11 months ago. That I had not committed a single procedural violation, not one missed filing, not one missed vote, not one breach of protocol, partly because I had been careful, partly because I had read all 10,000 pages of the charter and knew exactly where every trap was. 1 more month. That was all point one more month of a clean record, and I could invoke a clause that would give Earth full retroactive voting rights reaching back to the date we first entered the council that I looked up from the file. Priya was still working, calmly labeling documents, completely unaware that the balance of several major agreements had just shifted in my head. That I wrote down the clause number in my notebook, that I thanked her for her time. Then I left the archive and walked slowly back to my quarters through the long metal corridors of Nexus Station, thinking very carefully, because retroactive voting rights did not only mean symbolic status. They meant access to old decisions, old agreements, old resource designations, old arrangements made before Earth was in the room. And I already knew there were several of those agreements that had quietly marked the system's nearest Earth's future expansion path as resource zones already spoken for by the 5 most powerful member worlds, and O1 had told Earth at the time. Why would they have? We had not mattered yet. Now I was in the room. And soon, if I played this correctly, Earth would not just be in the room. Earth would be in the record that I thought about the rulebook they had handed me on my first day. That casual gesture. That huge document given to the human in the bad chair like a meaningless formality. I thought about the old earpiece, the seat on the edge of the chamber, the 3 months of being overlooked. I thought about Oliver Burke asking every 72 hours when I planned to become visible. Soon, I thought, very soon. Back in my quarters, I sat at the desk and began to write. Not in the notebook this time did I informal council language, precise, cold, clean, careful. I drafted the invocation once, then again, then a third time, making each version tighter than the last. When I was done, I saved it, closed the file, and went to sleep. The next morning, I attended the session exactly as I always did. Same seat, same bad earpiece, same quiet face. I said nothing, but I was smiling. And this time, I knew exactly why. The session that changed everything was not supposed to matter. That is important to understand. And O1 walked into that chamber expecting history. No one expected tension. No one expected disruption. It was supposed to be an ordinary council day, the kind that passed into the record without leaving much behind except another set of votes and another stack of formal documents. The item in question was called the Outer Arm Resource Compact. IT had been under quiet development for 8 months. On paper, it was a broad agreement between the 5 largest powers in the Galactic Council to open a stretch of systems in the Outer Arm for coordinated resource extraction. Open was the polite word. What it meant in practice was something much simpler. The Veth Dominion, the Solon, the Durak Assembly, the Collective of Myra, and the Yessen Sovereignty would divide up access to that region between themselves and hold effective control over extraction there for the next 200 years, several of. Those systems were not inside Earth's projected expansion corridor, but they were close enough to matter. Close enough that if humanity expanded the way every growth model said we eventually would, we would run straight into a wall of foreign operations on multiple sides. We would find ourselves boxed in by decisions made before we had a seat, before we had a voice, before anyone thought we were worth informing. I had known this for 2 months. I had said nothing. I had done nothing visible. I had spent those 2 months preparing. The session opened at the normal time. The chamber filled with the familiar layered noise of translation systems and procedural announcements. Ambassadors settled into their platforms. A Veth administrator opened the agenda. Item 1 passed. Then Item 2, clean, routine, unremarkable. Then Item 3 was called. Councillor Breath rose from the Veth platform to present the compact for formal ratification that he had the voice of someone used to speaking from the center of power. Deep, controlled, calm. He outlined the terms. He cited the supporting documents. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the result had already been decided before the vote was even called. When he finished, the Solon ambassador offered the second. That was standard procedure point. 3 smaller member worlds filed brief objections. Polite ones. Predictable ones. The kind that existed only so the official record could later show that concerns had been raised before being ignored. Then the floor opened for final statements before the vote. That I pressed the request indicator on my desk. There was a pause. That IT was a very small pause, barely long enough to notice unless you were paying close attention. But I noticed. because I was fairly sure no one in that chamber had ever seen me press it before. The administrator looked in my direction. His expression did not change much, but there was the slightest hint of surprise in the way he acknowledged me, as though he expected at most a brief, inexperienced comment that would be easy to absorb and easier to dismiss. I stood, and my chair scraped lightly against the floor behind me. In the hush of the chamber, even that small sound felt larger than it should have. Ambassador Voss of Earth, I said, I have a procedural matter to raise before this body proceeds to a vote. Across the hall, Breath turned his head toward me. Not casually, directly to IT was the first time in weeks he had looked at me, as though I might be relevant, that a few other ambassadors shifted as well, some with mild curiosity, some with that distant polite attention people give unexpected interruptions before deciding whether they are worth caring about. That I kept my voice steady. Under Article 7 of the Council Charter, I said, specifically the supplementary amendment to the Foundational Compact, ratified in the Council's 44th year, Clause 9 of Appendix 3, commonly referred to as the principle of foundational equity, I hereby formally invoke Earth's right to claim full retroactive membership status. Then I stopped talking. That part mattered. You do not bury a sentence like that under extra words. You let it sit in the room and do its work. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had heard in that chamber before. That IT was not boredom, that IT was not routine, that IT was not simple confusion, that IT was the silence of a room full of old political minds arriving at the same conclusion all at once. Did she just do what we think she did? I continued before anyone else could speak. Earth has completed 3 full council cycles without a recorded procedural violation. In accordance with the principle of foundational equity, our voting rights are therefore retroactive to the date of our original admission. I am formally submitting that invocation to the Council Secretariat at this time. I pressed the submission key on my desk panel. Somewhere beyond the main chamber, in the administrative corridor linked to the archive systems, Priya would be receiving the filing. 3 days earlier, in my quiet request, she had verified the clause independently and confirmed 2 things. First, that was valid. Second, that no probationary member in council history had ever invoked it. Because no probationary member in council history had apparently bothered to read the old founding appendices carefully enough to realize it was there, the chamber did not explode. The Galactic Council was too old and too formal for that. What it did instead was something much more dangerous. That IT broke in emotion. Requests began coming in from every side. Legal review. Procedural clarification. Questions from ambassadors to staff. Questions from staff to archives. Side consultations opened instantly across private channels. Translation systems surged under the load as multiple species spoke at once, rapidly and with unusual urgency. Counselor Breath had gone completely still. That was more alarming than anger would have been. The Solon ambassador, who always seemed faintly amused no matter what was happening, had for the first time lost that expression entirely. The central podium, the council's chief legal arbiter, a Durak named Counselor Orth, requested an immediate recess. That IT was granted. The session was suspended. What followed was 4 hours of legal review. I spent most of that time in a waiting room off one of the inner corridors, sitting alone with a cup of something from the station commissary that claimed to be tea and tasted vaguely like wet paper. It was hot, though, and it had caffeine, which at that moment was enough that I drank it slowly and waited. Oliver Burke called me 17 minutes into the recess. That I looked at the incoming signal, let it ring twice, then declined it and sent him a single message. Invoked foundational equity. In legal recess. We'll explain later. He responded almost immediately with a message made up mostly of question marks and alarm. I turned the communicator face down on the table and went back to waiting. To some point during that waiting, I realized something strange. That I was calmer than I had expected to be. Not calm in the sense of relaxed. I was not relaxed. My pulse was fast. My hands were cold. My thoughts were moving quickly and with a bright, sharp clarity that only comes when a decision has already been made and there is no longer any use in second-guessing it. But underneath all of that, there was a steadiness that I had prepared for this moment for weeks. Every filing had been clean. Every vote had been present. Every procedural detail had been exact. Every word of the invocation had been drafted, redrafted, checked against precedent, checked again, and stripped of anything unnecessary. If they wanted to challenge me, they would have to do it on the law. And on the law, I was ready. When the council reconvened, the chamber felt different. That it was the same room, the same platforms, the same heavy dark walls, an impossible ceiling. But the energy had changed. That a room can shift when everyone inside it has suddenly realized that something they considered settled is not settled at all. Counselor Orr stood at the central podium and delivered the decision. His voice was steady, professional, and almost painfully neutral. The principle of foundational equity was valid. It was applicable. It was binding. Earth's invocation was accepted. Our retroactive voting rights were confirmed and entered into the record. The chamber went quiet again. This time, it was not shocked. It was calculation. I stood. "Thank you," I said. Then I kept going. "In light of Earth's retroactive membership status, I am formally requesting procedural review of 3 prior council resolutions. The Helion Corridor Trade Agreement ratified 18 months ago, the Boundary Realignment Resolution passed 2 years ago, and the pre-allocation designation adopted 27 months ago." I paused only long enough for the words to register. "I am also filing a formal procedural objection to the Outer Arm Resource Compact currently before this body, on the grounds that the compact conflicts with rights Earth held at the time of those earlier agreements and was advanced without consultation or notification to a now recognized voting member." That was enough. The objection did not need to win immediately. It did not need to destroy the compact on the floor that day. It only needed to trigger review. And under council law, once a formal procedural objection of that kind was accepted, the compact could not be ratified until a mandatory review period had been completed. 90 days. Brett's expression did not change. That was one of the things that made him dangerous. He had not survived decades at the center of interstellar politics by letting his face tell the room what he was thinking. But I had spent 3 months watching him, and I knew his hands. The upper right hand, the second from the top, flattened against the surface of his desk with the fingers spread just slightly wider than before. That I had learned was the Veth equivalent of clenching a jaw. The Solon ambassador said nothing at all. Across the chamber, several of the smaller member worlds were already exchanging communications with each other. Quick bursts, immediate reactions, a kind of sharp, silent movement that passed across the outer seats like wind over grass. One of them, the representative from the DeVille people, looked directly at me. There was something in her expression I did not fully understand at the time. Later, I would that moment. All I knew was that she looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for the room to change shape and had just seen the first wall move. The session was adjourned for the day. I gathered my documents, stood, and walked out of the chamber alone. The corridors outside were full of motion. Fast footsteps, urgent voices, messages being sent in bursts across diplomatic channels. Translation traffic spiking. Staff moving more quickly than usual without quite running. Everything around me was urgent. Almost none of it was directed at me directly, and O1 stopped me, and O1 approached me, and O1 tried to speak to me in the corridor. I turned down a quieter passage, one of the narrower side routes that led toward residential quarters and archive access. And when I was finally out of sight, I leaned against the wall and let myself breathe, just for 30 seconds, and more than that, 30 seconds with my eyes closed, heart still hammering, mind racing forward into consequences I could already see beginning to unfold. Then I pushed myself upright, straightened my jacket, adjusted the data pad under my arm, and kept walking. Behind me, the Galactic Council was in more disorder than it had been in 4,000 years. That I smiled all the way home. I had expected resistance. What I had not expected was how quickly it arrived, and from how many directions at once. Within 48 hours, the response began. That told me something important. It told me the 5 major powers had imagined this kind of threat before. Not necessarily from Earth, and certainly not from me, but the speed of the response meant the framework had already existed. Somewhere in a drawer, somewhere in a private strategic archive, There had already been plans for what to do if a smaller member world found a lever inside procedure and tried to pull it hard enough to shake the room. The first line of attack was legal that a joint brief was filed by the Veth, the Solon, and the Durac, assembly challenging my invocation on 3 different procedural grounds. They were not foolish arguments. They were sophisticated, technical, carefully built. They pulled from secondary amendments, interpretive precedents, and old legal commentaries that most ambassadors would have needed an entire staff of specialists to find on short notice. That I had already prepared answers to all 3 that not after they filed the challenge. The night before the session, I had drafted responses to each likely line of attack, sealed them in the archive system, and marked them for timed release if needed. When the challenge arrived, I filed my counterbrief within 6 hours. The second line of attack was political. The Veth sent a quiet message to Earth's government. It was polite. Warm, even. No threats. No direct demands. Just a carefully worded suggestion that Ambassador Voss may have moved beyond what would normally be considered appropriate initiative for a probationary world still learning Council norms, and that Earth's long-term relationship with the Council's senior powers would likely benefit from a more cooperative tone. There was no need to say more than that. The meaning was obvious. Oliver Burke called me the same day that he was not panicking, which I respected, but his voice had that flat, careful quality people get when they're putting all their energy into sounding calm. "They're suggesting we recall you," he said. "They're suggesting you consider recalling me," I said. "That is not the same thing." Oliver, if you recall me now, everything collapses. The legal challenge wins by default. The objection disappears. The compact goes through unchanged. And Earth ends up weaker than before, because we will have taught them that pressure works. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "They are very large powers." "I know," I said. "That is why I prepared before I moved." Another pause. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that I have enough to hold the line. Trust me, for 30 more days." The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. When he finally answered, his voice was tight. "You have 20. I took it. The third line of attack was the one I had feared most. Set found me on the 4th day after the session that we were in one of the lower maintenance corridors of Nexus Station, a quiet route I sometimes used because almost no diplomatic staff ever went there. The walls were lined with environmental conduits and old service panels. The air smelled faintly metallic. Set's light pulses flickered in measured patterns. My earpiece translated them into that calm, patient voice that a contact arrangement had been made, Set told me, with a group known informally as the Shriven Syndicate. The Syndicate had no official office, no embassy, no listed representation. It was not a company in any normal sense. It was a network. When someone wanted a difficult problem removed quietly, professionally, and without paperwork, the Shriven Syndicate could often be persuaded to help. That I had been designated a problem. Set delivered this information with the same calm tone they used for everything, which somehow made it more frightening, not less that I thanked them. Set pulsed what I had come to recognize as concern. Then I took a different route back to my quarters. That night, I sat alone at my desk for a long time. Without moving, I want to be honest about this, I was afraid. There's a temptation, when people tell stories later, to polish fear into something noble, to call it bravery, to make it sound cleaner than it is. That is not what it felt like. It felt precise. It felt cold. It felt like every thought in my mind had suddenly become very sharp and very fast. Fear like that does not make you heroic. It strips away everything that does not matter and leaves only the next problem standing. That I had prepared for the possibility of this kind of move, because I was human, and because humans have a very long history of dealing with systems larger than themselves. That we have done it between countries, between institutions, between communities, between individuals. That we know what it is to sit in rooms built by other people, under rules designed to keep power where it already is, and search for the hinge point. Anyway, that we were not the strongest species in that council, that we were not the oldest, not the richest, not the most connected, but we were very, very experienced at finding angles. That night, I opened 3 files. The first was on Counselor Breath. Nothing criminal, nothing personal. What I had was a documented record of lobbying behavior that was not illegal under council procedure, but directly contradicted a transparency code the Veth Dominion had signed publicly 11 years earlier. Their official position and their actual conduct did not match. If that discrepancy became public, it would not destroy the Veth, but it would embarrass Breth badly enough to cost him his seat and likely trigger an ethics review that would weaken his current coalition. The second file was on the Solon ambassador, Counselor Vess. Months earlier, Kel had mentioned a financial arrangement tied to a Solon trade house. I had followed that thread carefully and quietly. It was not illegal under council law, but it was a clear conflict of interest when measured against 3 previous votes Vess had cast on trade zone designations that directly benefited the same commercial group. The Solon built much of their reputation on appearing above that kind of compromise that a formal disclosure would not only embarrass Vess, it would create years of procedural complications for the Solon government. The third file was on the Durack representative, Counselor Pell. The Durack Assembly had an internal faction struggle running beneath the surface of its politics. Pell represented the faction currently in power. Through months of listening, cross-checking, and reading public records against private timing, I had found evidence that Pell had been conducting undeclared diplomatic contact with a rival outer sector power. Not a council crime, but within the Durack internal system, it would be damaging, possibly catastrophic. These files were not weapons. Not exactly. They were leverage. That matters that a weapon says, I can hurt you. Leverage says, I know what this will cost you, and so do you. Now, let us decide what happens next. Within 48 hours of Set's warning, I requested private meetings with all 3. Breth agreed. First, we met in a neutral consultation room. No odds, no visible staff. Just the 2 of us across a plain table under soft station light. He sat with that same still control he always carried, the posture of someone who had expected this conversation might come and had already prepared himself for it. I placed my datapad on the table between us, face down. Then I spoke that I did not threaten him. That would have been foolish. Threats turn people defensive. Defensiveness makes them harder to move. Instead, I explained that I told him what I had found. I told him what I would do with it if the pressure campaign continued. I told him what I would not do if it stopped. I made it very clear that I had no interest in chaos for its own sake. I was not trying to burn down the council. I was trying to prevent Earth from being shut out of its own future by people who assumed we would never be in a position to object. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he asked in that deep, measured voice, How long have you been building those files? Since my 2nd week, I said. Another silence. Then he asked, Were you ever genuinely uncertain about your position here? For a moment, I thought about lying that it would have been easy to say no. To act as though I had always known what I was doing, always believed I would succeed, always understood my place in the room. But that would have been stupid. He would have known. I told the truth. Yes, I said. Constantly. He looked at me for a few seconds more. Then he said, I will make 3 calls this afternoon. The Shriven Syndicate contract was canceled within 36 hours. Within a week, the legal challenge had been quietly reduced from 3 arguments to 1. And it was the weakest 1. My meetings with Vess and Pell followed much the same pattern. Not warm, not easy, not friendly, but productive. That be why the end of the 2nd week, all 3 had moved from active opposition to careful neutrality. That was enough. Oliver Burr called me on the 18th day. The pressure has stopped, he said. He sounded confused, which was understandable. From Earth's side, it probably looked as though a storm had simply died in midair. Good, I said. What did you do? I had conversations, I said. Diplomatic ones. He was quiet. Then, after a pause, he asked, Are you all right? It was the first time he had asked me that. I turned in my chair and looked out through the small port window in my quarters. Beyond the glass was deep space, black and still and absolute, with none of the comforting light of a nearby sun. Just distance, just silence. Yes, I said, and for the first time in days, that was almost true. Not because I had won, not because the danger was gone, not because the next weeks would be easy, but because I had passed through the part where fear controls you and arrived at the part where only the next move matters. That I ended the call. Then I opened my notebook and began planning what came next. 90 days is a long time in galactic politics. The IT is also, if used properly, exactly enough time to rearrange the future. I spent the first week of the review period doing something the five major powers did not expect, that I stopped pushing against them directly. Instead, I turned and started speaking to everyone else. There were 48 member worlds in the Galactic Council. 5 of them held most of the power. The other 43 had spent generations living inside a system that was technically shared and practically uneven. They were not powerless, not exactly, but they were used to a certain kind of life inside the chamber. They were used to being consulted late, if at all, used to learning about major decisions only after the shape of those decisions had already been fixed, used to voting on outcomes they had not helped design. They had learned patience, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from understanding that the room is arranged for someone else's comfort, and that making too much noise about it rarely changes where the furniture is. That I understood that view better than most of them realized, that I had been sitting in the outer ring from my first day, that I knew what it felt like to watch the center of the chamber behave as though the edges were decorative. SOI began. There, the first person I went to was the Taville representative. Her name was Counselor N. I had not forgotten the way she had looked at me across the chamber after I invoked the foundational equity clause. It had not been shock exactly. It had been recognition. The kind that happens when someone sees a move they had wanted to make for years and realizes, too late, that someone else has made it first. That we met in one of the small public gardens on Nexus Station, a quiet pressurized enclosure filled with plant life from a dozen different worlds. Some of it resembled what a human would call trees. Some looked like ribbons of glass growing upward from black soil. There was water moving somewhere out of sight, soft enough to make the space feel private without seeming designed for privacy, and arrived exactly on time. That told me something already. People who do not take a conversation seriously often arrive late on purpose. It is a way of beginning with imbalance. She sat across from me and waited that I did not waste her time with abstract talk. I told her what I was doing, not in broad idealistic language, not in speeches about fairness or the future. Specifics. The Outer Arm Resource Compact. The 3 prior agreements I had reopened. The 90-day review window. The parts of the compact I believed could be changed if enough worlds acted together instead of allowing themselves to be spoken for individually. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked the only question that actually mattered. "What do you want from us?" "Your voice," I said. She did not react. "Not your vote," I added. "Not yet. Not a public commitment. I want your willingness to join a conversation before the outcome is settled by someone else." And leaned back slightly and studied me. "Why?" she asked. "Should the Taville risk damaging a relationship with the Veth that we have spent 60 years carefully managing?" It was a fair question. IT was also the correct question. That if she had asked anything softer, I would have trusted her less. That I had prepared for that question before I ever sent the meeting request. Because, I said, that relationship has cost you more than it has given you for a very long time. She said nothing. That I kept going. "You have maintained it carefully. You have been disciplined, predictable, cooperative, reasonable, and in return, you have been allowed to remain adjacent to decisions rather than part of them. The arrangement is stable. It is also unequal. You know that. The Veth know that you know it. Nothing changes because the price of pushing back has always been higher than the value of the possible gain." I let that sit for a moment. "I am offering you a different calculation." Still she said nothing. That was fine. Silence is often where the real part of a conversation happens. Finally, she asked, "And if this fails?" "Then," I said, "you will still be where you are now, careful, underweight, and politely ignored. But if it works, even partially, then the shape of the room changes. Not just for Earth, for everyone who has been sitting where we sit." And looked away from me for a moment, toward a stand of low blue leaf plants growing beside the path. Then she asked, "Are you asking the Taville to fight the Veth?" "No," I said. "I am asking you to come to a table." That was what mattered. Not war, not rebellion, not grand declarations. At a table, at a place where people who had always been spoken to separately could hear each other in the same room. After a while, and nodded once, not agreement in full. Not yet, but enough the Taville would come to the table. That was one. Over the next 2 weeks, I had versions of the same conversation with 6 other delegations. Not identical. It is a mistake to treat coalitions like collections of the same person wearing different faces. Every world had its own reasons, its own frustrations, its own threshold for risk. The Asari Compact came next. Their civilization was old, oceanic, and deeply cautious. Their home systems bordered parts of the proposed extraction zone. The original compact had treated that as an inconvenience rather than a factor worth discussing. The Asari did not like conflict, but they liked being ignored even less. Then the Drovan Union, 3 small worlds with a history of technical competence and almost no political leverage. For 40 years, they had been trying to gain a formal position on the Council's Resource Oversight Committee. For 40 years, they had been thanked for their expertise and denied actual influence. Then the Pelion Assembly. Brilliant engineers. Quiet, methodical, indispensable to several major extraction operations. For decades, they had been underpaid because the terms had been locked in long before they had enough standing in council politics to negotiate properly. Everyone admired their skill. No one was in a hurry to compensate them fairly for it. Then others, a border civilization whose shipping lanes have been altered 3 times in 20 years to benefit larger powers, a mineral-poor system that relied on transit rights and had watched those rights shrink by procedural drift rather than direct vote. A new member world still trying to understand why every welcome speech in the council seemed so warm, while every actual decision somehow left them smaller than before. Every conversation was different, but all of them had one thing in common. The person across from me had spent years, and in some cases generations, living with the frustration that everyone treated as normal simply because it had lasted so long that I listened to all of it. That was the real work. Not speaking, listening. There's a kind of political mistake people make when they're trying to build something quickly. They think persuasion means arriving with answers. They think leadership means being the loudest person in the room. They think if they explain the strategy well enough, everyone else will naturally align behind it. That is not how coalitions work. Coalitions are built from attention, from making it clear to each person at the table that their problem is not an afterthought in someone else's plan. But part of the reason the plan exists at all. I listened, that I asked questions, that I took notes, that I did not promise miracles, that I did not pretend I could deliver everything everyone wanted. I was very careful about that. False. Promises create fast alliances and even faster collapses. What I offered instead was something much smaller, and because of that, much more believable. Leveraged, a chance to force renegotiation, a chance to be inside the conversation before the outcome hardened, a chance, maybe, to move the room a few inches away from where it had been standing for the last 4,000 years. One by one, they agreed to come. Not publicly, not all at once, quietly, carefully, but they came. The 5 major powers noticed. Of course, there was never any chance they would not. Their intelligence networks were older than some civilizations. Their staff could follow patterns long before those patterns reached the floor of the chamber. By the time I had held my 4th private meeting, I was certain at least 3 of the major delegations knew I was building something. Breath sent me a message in the 5th week. Officially, it was an inquiry about the status of the review process. That I, in practice, it was asking one question. What exactly do you think you are assembling? Council diplomacy rarely says the real thing directly. That is one of the reasons it lasts so long. Almost everything important is said sideways, through implication, through structure, through what is included and what is carefully left unsaid. I answered in the same language. Something that benefits everyone, if everyone is willing. That was what I sent back. Breath did not respond immediately. When he finally did, 3 days later, his message was not warm, but it was not hostile either. That IT was cautious. That mattered. Caution is what powerful people feel when they're no longer entirely sure they control the next stage of events. In the 6th week, I made the next move. I formally proposed a revised version of the compact. Not a rejection. That would have failed. A rejection is easy to oppose. It forces people into fixed positions. It turns negotiation into pride. And pride is one of the strongest walls in politics. I proposed a modification. The five major powers would keep the core extraction rights they wanted. That part stayed, but the scale was reduced. The structure changed. New oversight conditions were added. A rotating seat would be created for worlds geographically adjacent to the extraction zone. A protected corridor would be established around the system's nearest Earth's future path of expansion. Not closed, not blocked, but protected by a mandatory consultation requirement before new extraction activity could begin, and, most importantly, a new seat would be added to the Resource Oversight Committee. The developing world shared at IT would not belong permanently to Earth. That was important. If I had asked for a seat specifically for humanity, the coalition would have weakened immediately. Too many worlds would have seen the truth of it. Earth using the language of fairness to carve out special treatment for itself. I did not do that. The new seat would be open to any member world admitted within the past 100 years that had not yet held a committee post. It would rotate every 10 years. That meant the structure would outlast me. Outlast Earth's immediate needs. Outlast the specific conflict that had created the opening in the first place. That IT meant I was not just fighting for a better outcome in one compact, that I was trying to change the machinery. The major powers pushed back immediately. Of course they did. Breath attacked the weaknesses in the language with the calm precision of someone who had spent most of his life negotiating from strength. He found every unclear term, every place where interpretation might later expand beyond what he was willing to accept, every line that might set a precedent he did not like. The Solon were subtler. They worked at the edges, private offers, individual incentives, quiet messages to smaller delegations that certain future trade concerns might be handled more generously if they chose not to tie themselves too closely to Earth's position. This did not surprise me. Coalitions are strongest before someone starts trying to buy them apart. I had expected pressure that I had built for it. That is why I had spoken to more worlds than I strictly needed. That is why I had looked for those with specific reasons to stay, rather than those who merely liked the sound of my argument. Enthusiasm can be bought off. Need is harder to move. Point two worlds accepted the side offers. That I had expected that too. The moment I learned they had stepped back, I crossed their names out in the notebook and recalculated. I still had enough. That is one of the less glamorous parts of strategy. You do not build assuming perfect loyalty. You build assuming loss, pressure, compromise, fatigue, and fear. Then you make sure the thing still stands when some of that arrives. The negotiations dragged on for 4 weeks. Long meetings, longer drafts, endless revisions, entire days spent on the wording of a single clause because everyone in the room understood that word becomes systems once they are written into law. Several times, it looked as though the entire effort might collapse. Once over oversight language. Once over corridor protections. Once because the Durack decided to make a show of procedural resistance that had less to do with substance than with reminding everyone they could still slow the process if they wanted to. Each time, we kept moving, slowly, painfully, but forward to be why the 87th day of the 90-day review period, an agreement was finally reached, not the agreement the five powers had wanted, not the agreement I would have written alone if I had possessed unlimited power. That is another thing worth saying plainly, that a successful negotiation rarely ends with anyone getting exactly what they wanted. If it does, it usually means everyone else at the table lost more than they understood in the moment. This was something harder and better than that. A compact reshaped so heavily that the original version was barely recognizable. The five major powers kept access, but not unchecked access. The protected zone remained. The oversight structure changed, the new committee seat remained. The consultation framework remained, and the developing and overlooked worlds of the council, the ones who had spent generations voting around decisions instead of through them, now had something they had not had before, a mechanism. The vote was called IT passed, not unanimously. The Solon abstained on 2 clauses. The Durack filed a formal objection to the oversight structure that everyone in the room understood was more political theater than serious resistance. But the vote passed. The revised Outer Arm Resource Compact was ratified by the Galactic Council. That I sat in my seat at the far edge of the chamber and watched the result appear on the display in front of me. That I had not asked for a better seat I had not asked for a better earpiece either. I was still in the outer ring, still at the desk that did not fit, still the representative of the species that had arrived late and been expected to remain grateful and quiet. None of that had mattered. When the session ended, the chamber took longer than usual to empty. That is what happens after a vote that everyone knows will be remembered. People linger. They talk in low voices. They compare interpretations. They begin the next stage before the current one has even properly finished it. I gathered my things slowly. There was no need to rush. That I was almost at the exit when I heard my name. That I turned. The being walking toward me was the elder representative of the Oronisi collective. His name was Counselor Air. He had been on the council for nearly 200 years. The Oronisi were never physically imposing. Air was small, pale, delicate in structure, but he moved with the kind of stillness that only comes from immense age and perfect patience. Nothing about him seemed hurried. He carried time around himself the way some people carry authority. He stopped in front of me. "Ambassador Voss," he said. His translation came through in that dry, careful whisper I had heard from his species before. "If you are willing, there is something I would like to understand." "Of course," I said. He folded his thin hands lightly before him. "On your first day in this chamber," he said, "before any session had truly begun, before you had spoken to anyone, I observed you take your seat and smile." I said nothing. "You smiled again today when the vote concluded," he went on. "And I have noticed, over the months between those moments, that you have smiled at many points during this process, including some at which any reasonable observer would have expected concern instead." He paused. "I have served on this council for nearly 2 centuries. I have seen many new member world arrive. I do not believe I have ever seen one smile as often as you have." For a second, despite everything, I nearly laughed. "I did not realize it was that noticeable," I said. "Only to those paying close attention," Air replied. Which I admit I was not, at first. Around us, the chamber was still emptying. Voices echoed softly through the huge space. The ceiling clouds moved slowly overhead. Air tilted his head slightly. "What does it mean?" he asked. "The smiling." I took a breath, because I knew this answer mattered more than it sounded like it did. I thought about my first day. The wrong chair. The old earpiece. The rulebook handed over as a formality. The months of being overlooked. Priya in the archive. Set in the maintenance corridor. Oliver calling every 72 hours. And agreeing to sit at a table. The first time I realized that neglect and freedom can sometimes arrive wearing the same face. When I walked into this chamber, I said I was one person representing a world that had been here for 11 months. Every civilization in this room had more history than I did. More alliances. More power. More tradition. Nobody expected me to do anything meaningful. Air waited. "On Earth," I said, "we have a very long history of being in exactly that position. Not enough resources. Not enough allies. Not enough time. Smaller than the thing we are facing. Later to start. Further behind. We have lived in that position at every scale you can imagine, between nations, between institutions, between communities, between individual people." I looked across the chamber toward the central podium. "And what we have learned from that history is that when nobody expects anything from you, you gain something the people at the center almost never have." Air was very still. "Freedom," I said, that made him blink once. "Nobody is watching closely," I continued. "Nobody thinks you matter enough to model. Nobody has prepared a full response, because no one believes you are capable of changing the structure. So you get time. You get space. You get the ability to read the rulebook they handed you as a joke and discover that one of the doors they all assumed was closed was never locked at all. The hall was almost empty now that I could hear distant movement in the corridors beyond. "You can make friends," I said, "with the people no one important ever bothers to talk to. You can build things quietly in places the powerful have stopped noticing. You could do a great deal in the space between someone else's assumptions." Air was silent for a long time. Then he asked, softly, "And the smiling?" This time I did smile again. "The smiling," I said, "is because there's a special kind of joy in being underestimated." He made no movement, but his attention sharpened. "It is not cruel," I said. "It is not even really about proving anyone wrong. It is the feeling of standing in a room full of doors that everyone else has already dismissed and realizing that with enough patience, enough attention, and a very good memory for footnotes, some of them open quite easily. For the first time since he had approached me, something in Air's expression changed. It was subtle, but I was learning the Orinizat it was warmth. "We will not underestimate your world again," he said. "I know," I said. "That's all right. I already got what I needed." He inclined his head. Then he turned and walked away into the corridor beyond the chamber doors. I remained where I was for a moment after he left, alone in that enormous hall with its impossible ceiling and drifting clouds and 4,000 years of habit still clinging to the walls. Only now the habits had shifted just slightly, enough to matter, enough to last that I stood there and thought about Earth. About an entire planet of people moving through ordinary days, completely unaware that any of this had happened. People commuting to work, making dinner, falling asleep, missing trains, writing reports, having arguments, laughing with friends, going on with their lives with no idea that very far away, in a chamber built by civilizations older than human language, a woman in a bad chair had spent 3 months reading footnotes, asking careful questions, and making sure their future would be wider than it had been the week before. I would call Oliver tomorrow. He would have many questions that I would answer most of them. But in that moment, I just stood there and let myself feel it. Not triumph. Not exactly. Not relief either, though there was some relief. It was something quieter, something steadier that I had arrived with a rulebook, a clean procedural record, and a very human habit of looking for the angle no one else had bothered to test. Now I was leaving with reopened agreements, a protected corridor, a new committee structure, and a coalition of worlds that had never before had reason to act together. Not bad, I thought, for the species with the wrong chair. Then I turned off the lights in my section of the chamber, a small automatic courtesy, and walked into the corridor. Behind me, the Galactic Council was louder than it had been before I arrived, more contested, more complicated, more alive. That was fine. A dozen smaller worlds had already sent meeting requests to my office, and my office was still just me, a data pad, and a notebook full of handwriting no one else could easily read. That was also fine that I had time. And somewhere behind me, 47 civilizations were learning, very slowly, to pay attention to the human in the room. I smiled. All the way home. The strange thing about changing a system is that the change does not end when the vote ends. That is the part most people do not see. They imagine one moment, one decision, one dramatic shift after which everything is different and everyone understands that it is different. That is not how institutions work. Institutions absorb shocks slowly. They bend, then pause, then spend a long time pretending they have not been at all. The Galactic Council was no different. The vote on the revised compact had passed. The room had changed. The record had changed. The law had changed. But the people inside that system still needed time to understand what exactly had happened to them. For the first few days after the agreement, Nexus Station felt like a place recovering from a controlled explosion. Nothing was visibly broken, and no alarms were sounding. The lights still worked. The session still opened on time. The translation systems still hummed in the walls. Ambassadors still crossed the corridors in formal robes and measured silence, surrounded by aides trying to look as though they were not hurrying. But underneath all of that, everything was moving. Every smaller member world that had spent decades being politely managed was now recalculating. Every large power that had built its strategy on stable assumptions was checking those assumptions again. Every person in the station's support structure, from archive staff to translators to legal clerks, suddenly understood that the human in the outer ring was not an accidental appointment who would eventually be guided into proper quiet behavior. I had become a variable. That was useful. That IT was also dangerous, because once people understand that you matter, they stop giving you the one gift they had been giving you from the beginning: inattention. That was fine. I had known from the start that the freedom of being ignored would not last forever. It did not need to. Freedom is most useful at the beginning, when you're still building. Once the structure exists, attention becomes a different kind of tool. The morning after the vote, I woke to 14 formal meeting requests. BY midday, there were 20-3. BY evening, 31. Some came from world in my coalition. They wanted to talk about next steps, committee structure, oversight language, implementation timing, and whether the new seat rotation could be widened later if enough support existed. Some came from worlds that had stayed quiet through the review period and were now trying to decide whether they had made a mistake by staying too quiet. And some, more interestingly, came from representatives of the major powers. Careful requests. Courteous language. No mention of concern. No admission of miscalculation. Just an increased desire for direct communication. That alone told me how much the room had shifted that I did not answer all of them immediately. That was not pettiness that IT was pacing. When people have spent months believing they can reach you only when convenient for them, it is useful to remind them, gently, professionally, and without ever saying so, that your time also has a structure now. Oliver Burke called before breakfast station time. This time I answered. There was a brief silence when the connection opened, the kind that happens when someone has rehearsed a conversation and then forgotten how they intended to begin it. Finally, he said so. I sat down at my desk and looked at the stack of incoming requests waiting on my data pad. So, I agreed. There was another pause. Then Oliver laughed, not loudly. Not for very long, but genuinely. I spent the last 12 hours reading summaries from 3 departments, he said, and I would like you to know that none of them agree on exactly how you did this. That seems healthy, I said. It does not feel healthy from this side. I smiled a little and leaned back in the chair. Even in my own quarters, the furniture was still slightly wrong. Nexus Station had adjusted some of my environment to human standards, but not enough to make it feel natural. There was still always the faint sense that I had been placed into a space designed by someone who had read about humans rather than lived with them. How bad is the reaction on Earth? I asked. Oliver let out a slow breath. Publicly, there's almost no reaction yet, because most of the details are still classified and the general public does not fully understand what the Galactic Council actually does. Privately, it is considerably louder. In a good way? In several ways at once, he said. The Foreign Directorate thinks you are brilliant. The Trade Office thinks you have just saved us 20 years of strategic disadvantage. The defense people would like to know whether this means the Veth will be more hostile now. The Prime Minister's office would like a version of events that is both accurate and does not give anyone heart failure. That may be difficult. Yes, Oliver said dryly. I had noticed. I looked down at the notebook beside my desk. It was open to a page of fast cramped notes from the previous night. Names, sectos, requests, timelines, the beginning of the next map. How much political trouble am I in? I asked. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Less than you were 2 weeks ago, he said. More than you would be if you had spent your first year giving harmless speeches and losing politely. That seems fair. Another pause. Then his voice changed a little, softer, less official. You did well, Dara. That should not have mattered as much as it did. But it did. I had been moving so quickly for so long that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear someone say the simple thing plainly. Not you survived. Not you managed. Not this might still become acceptable in hindsight. You did well. Thank you, I said. He cleared his throat, as if he had accidentally stepped too close to sincerity and needed to recover. So, he said again more briskly, what happens now? I looked out the small port window of my quarters. Beyond it, the blackness between stars stretched in every direction, still and endless and cold. Now, I said, they start trying to understand whether this was one move or the beginning of a pattern. And what is it? I thought about the question. Then I looked back at the notebook. The beginning, I said. Oliver sighed in a way that told me several new headaches had just formed behind his eyes. Of course it is, he said. After the call ended, I spent the next 6 hours in meetings. The first was with Counselor Anna the DeVille. Unlike our earlier conversations, this one no longer needed to happen in quiet gardens or neutral corners of the station. The work had crossed from possibility into structure. We met in a formal consultation room with full records running and 2 legal aides present on our side. One on mine, if you counted the archive clerk I had borrowed for procedural support. That in was different now. Not transformed. People do not become entirely new because one vote goes their way. But she carried herself with less caution, or perhaps with a different kind of caution. Before, she had spoken like someone measuring the cost of every sentence before letting it leave her mouth. Now she spoke like someone who had remembered that cost and decided it was no longer the only number worth calculating. We should discuss permanence, she said once we had reviewed the basic implementation schedule. Of the oversight language? I asked. Of the coalition? That was the real question. Not the compact. Not anymore. The coalition, the thing that had been built for one fight and might now survive long enough to become something larger than the fight that created it. I folded my hands on the table and considered her. Do you want permanence? I asked it and did not answer quickly. That was one of the reasons I liked her. Yes, she said at last. But not if permanence means turning one temporary alignment into another rigid block. The Council has enough of those already. I nodded. I agree. She leaned slightly forward. Then what do you want it to become? It was a good question, and the answer, inconveniently, was that I had not fully decided, yet that I knew what I did not want to build a smaller imitation of the same power structures we had just spent months pushing against. I did not want Earth to become important by learning the habits of the people who had spent centuries treating importance as ownership. I did not want a coalition of overlooked worlds to survive only long enough to become another machine that forgot how neglect feels once it had enough leverage to stop fearing it. But not wanting the wrong thing is easier than defining the right one. A voting block would be easier, I said, yes, and replied, and more dangerous. Yes, she said again. That settled it. The coalition would remain a coalition, not formalized into a permanent faction. Not yet. Instead, it would begin as a consultation framework. Regular contact. Shared review of major proposals. Early warning when one world saw something affecting several others. No enforced voting alignment. No oath of loyalty. No central leadership structure that could later harden into the very kind of hierarchy we had all been trying to resist. Messier, slower, harder to control, which usually means closer to being real. And listen while I explain the idea. When I finished, she said, that will require trust. Yes, I said, and trust is slower than outrage. That is also true. For the first time in the meeting, she smiled. Very human, she said. Painfully so, I replied. She agreed to help build it. That mattered. The next meeting was with the Asari, then the Pelion delegation. Then two smaller transit worlds that had not joined the original review coalition but wanted in on whatever came next. By the end of the day, one thing had become clear. The revised compact had done more than solve one resource problem. IT had made a number of smaller worlds realize that the Council's machinery, while old and heavy, was not sacred. That IT could be moved. Not easily, not often, but moved. That realization is dangerous in any political system. Once people know the walls are structural rather than divine, they start testing other walls. The major powers understood this too. That was why the next message from Counselor Breath arrived before the day was over. Unlike the earlier one, this was not indirect. IT was formal, but direct at a request for private consultation. No subject line. Beyond that, no staff attached. And secondary names listed. Just Breath. I accepted. We met the next evening in one of the same neutral rooms where we had spoken before. He was already there when I arrived. The room was simple. A low table. Two chairs adjusted to very different body types. Soft station lighting. Walls designed in that neutral diplomatic style that belongs nowhere and offends no one. Breath inclined his head when I entered. Ambassador Voss. Counselor. We Saturday for a moment. Neither of us spoke. Then he said, you understand, I assume, that several governments now believe you intend to build a durable counterweight to the existing council order. There was no accusation in his voice. That was interesting. Only observation. Several governments, I said, have become very imaginative quite suddenly. That is one way to describe it. I folded my hands in my lap. In your way? He regarded me for a moment. My way, he said, is that systems become unstable when too many actors begin testing their limits at once. That depends on the system. I said, no, he replied. It depends on whether the people testing those limits understand the cost of instability. He said calmly, not as a threat, as a fact that I believed he meant it that way. Breath was not sentimental about order. He simply belonged to the kind of civilization that had survived by treating order as infrastructure. You did not take infrastructure lightly if you had spent centuries building your entire political position on it. I do understand the cost, I said. Do you? The question was not mocking. That made it heavier that I looked at him across the table and thought about the last several months. About fear, about the syndicate contract, about the pressure on Earth, about the quiet desperation in some of the smaller delegations when they spoke about 30 years, 50 years, a century of being structurally managed out of consequence. Yes, I said. I think I understand it differently than you do. Breath said nothing at S.O., I continued. The council was already unstable, I said. It was simply stable in a direction that favored the people at the center. Those are not the same thing. He watched me. Smaller worlds were losing confidence, I said. Not in this vote. In the institution itself. Slowly, quietly. The kind of loss that does not make noise until it has gone too far to repair. You call what I did destabilizing. I think it may have prevented a worse kind of fracture later. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, but not dismissal either. You think in long arcs, he said. I had to learn. Humans usually do. I almost smiled. The successful ones. That got the smallest change from him. Not quite amusement. Something near it. Then he leaned back slightly and said, there is concern that you intend to reopen additional prior agreements. Now, that was useful. Not because of the content. Because of the phrasing, there is concern, which meant there had already been conversations, which meant I had space. Should there be? I asked. That depends, he said, on whether you intend to. I'll let the silence stretch for a few seconds. Not long enough to feel theatrical. Just long enough to remind him that answers have weight. Not immediately. I said IT was the truth. There were other agreements I could potentially challenge. Other structures I could test. Other old decisions made in rooms where Earth had not mattered yet. But force is most effective when it is selective. Use it too often and people stop underestimating you in the useful way and start preparing for you in the expensive way. Breath knew that too. He gave a slow nod. That, he said, will be taken as reassuring. Good. We sat in silence again for a moment. Then he asked, what do you want, Ambassador? It was the most honest thing he had said to me in any room that I answered with the same honesty. I want Earth included in decisions that shape Earth's future. That is obvious. I want smaller and newer worlds to stop being treated as temporary participants in a structure that expects permanent obedience. That, he said, is less simple. Yes. And beyond that, I thought about it, then answered carefully. I want a council that does not confuse longevity with ownership. Breath looked at me for a very long time. Then he said, that goal will make you admired by some and intolerable to others. I had guessed. He stood. The meeting was over. S.O. I stood to AT the door. Before I left, he said, the danger in changing a room is that you must then live in it. I turned back toward him. The danger in never changing it, I said, is that eventually someone stops believing the room is worth staying in. For a second, the silence between us felt almost like respect. Then I left. The next few weeks were filled with infrastructure. That is the least glamorous phrase possible, but it is the correct one. People love stories about moments. They rarely understand how much history is actually built out of administration. There were committee drafts to review, rotation schedules to design, consultation requirements to define in precise enough language that future governments could not simply pretend they meant something smaller than everyone knew they meant. There were procedural maps to build for newer worlds that wanted to understand how to use the council more effectively without spending 11 months reading 10,000 pages alone in their quarters. That I helped build all of it. Some of it personally, some by connecting the right delegations to one another, some simply by asking questions in meetings that forced people to clarify assumptions they would have preferred to leave vague. That became, over time, a kind of reputation, not the human who had embarrassed the major powers, though some saw me that way. Not even the human who found the old claws, though that story spread faster than I liked it. No, the more useful reputation was quieter. The human who read things, the human who noticed things The human who asked the question in the room that made everyone go back and check what they thought they understood. That kind of reputation lasts longer. And it opens better doors. Point one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the vote, I found myself back in the archive with Priya. She was sorting updated procedural filings into their proper sequence, muttering occasionally under her breath when some department had mislabeled something important. I like the part, she said without looking up, where half the chamber suddenly remembered archival indexing mattered. I laughed. It was a strong moment. It was an irritating moment, she said. Do you know how many urgent retrieval requests we got in the first 6 hours? I can imagine. No, you can't. That was probably true. She slid one file into place, then glanced at me. They're being nicer to me now, she said. Who? Everyone. The way she said it made clear she found this only partly flattering. Archive staff are suddenly very important, I said. We always were. Yes, I said. That is usually how it works. She snorted softly and went back to sorting. After a minute, she asked, Did you know it would go that far? I thought about the question. No, I said. I knew it could. I did not know it would. Priya nodded as though that answer matched something she had already guessed. Then she said, Good. I looked at her. Why good? Because if you had known exactly how big it was going to become and done it anyway, I would have worried about you. I smiled. That seems fair. She gave me a sideways look. I already worried about you, obviously. But I would have worried in a different way. That stayed with me long after I left the archive, because she was right. There's a line, sometimes very thin, between strategy and appetite. Between moving a system because it must be moved and moving it because you begin to enjoy the feeling of making large things shake. The second kind of person is dangerous, that I had met them on Earth, that I had met them on Nexus Station too. I did not want to become one that I kept reminding myself, as often as I needed to, that the goal was not motion for its own sake. The goal was room. Room for Earth. Room for others. Room for futures that did not have to be requested from the people who had grown too comfortable deciding which futures counted. That was enough. More than enough, really. Still, I smiled often. I noticed that too. Not because things had become easy. They had not. Some delegations were colder now. Some meetings were sharper. Some smiles were more careful than before. Every success creates its own backlash. That is normal. But underneath all of it, the thing that had made me smile on the first day was still there. That same feeling. The feeling that comes when you realize the architecture of a problem is not as perfect as the people in charge want it to seem. The feeling of hidden hinges. Unwatched doors that a lock system that, under the right pressure, turns out to be full of handles. WY the end of the month. I was no longer the human no one noticed. That chapter was over. When I entered the chamber now, conversations shifted. Heads turned. Some of the older ambassadors did not bother pretending otherwise. A few of the smaller worlds nodded to me openly. Staff across the station had begun greeting me with the quiet confidence reserved for people who had survived a difficult season and were now understood to belong. The chair was still wrong, though. That never changed that I could have requested an adjustment that I never did. Partly because there were always more important things to do. Partly because, over time, I came to like it. The wrong chair had become a reminder of the first day of what they thought I was of what underestimation feels like from the inside, and of how useful that feeling can be if you do not let it turn into bitterness. People often assume power changes you by making you larger. That is not always true. Sometimes what it really does is make your memory more important, that if you can remember what it felt like before anyone listened, then when they finally do listen, you have a chance, just a chance, not to become the sort of person who only hears voices once they're loud enough to be inconvenient. That was the work now. Not just protecting Earth's position, not just keeping the coalition alive in its loose, useful shape, but remembering the outer ring, remembering the edges, remembering the view from the badly placed chair, because systems drift, always, and if you're not careful, even the people who change them can become part of the reason they need changing again. I kept the notebook, that I kept listening, that I kept asking staff what they thought long after many ambassadors would have considered that unnecessary. And every now and then, when the chamber grew too full of old confidence and practice certainty, I would look around at the dark, curving walls, the impossible ceiling, the worlds that had once treated Earth as a temporary convenience, and I would feel that same quiet thing settle in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, something better. Possibility. The Council had not become fair. Not why ET had not become equal. Perhaps it never fully would. Old systems rarely transform all at once. They shift by degrees, sometimes by inches, sometimes by one clause buried in a forgotten appendix, sometimes by one conversation in a garden, sometimes by one vote on a day that was supposed to be ordinary, but it had changed, and now everyone in that room knew it could change again. That was enough for the moment, enough to begin building whatever came next, and somewhere, not very far behind that thought, was the one that had been waiting patiently for me from the beginning. The species with the wrong chair was still here, and now the whole room knew it. What came next did not happen all at once. That would have been simpler, cleaner too, but real change, especially inside old institutions, rarely arrives in one clear line. It comes in layers, in reactions, in small adjustments that only later reveal themselves as part of something larger. The weeks after the compact vote became the beginning of a new kind of life for me on Nexus Station. Before, I'd been easy to ignore. Now I was not. Before, I could walk into a corridor and feel conversations continue around me, as though I were furniture. Now conversations paused. Not every time, but often enough to notice. That is one of the stranger parts of becoming visible inside a political system. People imagine it feels like victory. Sometimes it does, but often it just feels louder. More eyes on you. More calculations happening in real time around your presence. More people trying to decide whether they should treat you as useful, dangerous, temporary, or all three at once. That I adapted. You always do, if you stay long enough. That I built routines. Morning briefing review. Message responses in priority tiers. Coalition consultations twice weekly. Archive hours every third day when I could manage them. Quiet dinners alone when the station became too full of voices and I needed to hear my own thoughts again. The notebook grew heavier, not physically. It was the same paper notebook it had always been, but by then it held months of observation, names, patterns, private notes, historical references, procedural ideas, questions to follow later, and the rough first outlines of problems that had not yet become public but would eventually become important. There's a comfort in that kind of record. Digital files can be searched. They can be copied. They can be tracked. A notebook asks something else from you. Patience. Memory. The willingness to turn pages slowly and let connections rise by hand. Mine had become, in a way, a map of the council that existed beneath the official one, not the chamber as it appeared in formal diagrams. The real chamber. The one made of trust, resentment, old favors, quiet debts, wounded pride, institutional habit, and those tiny overlooked human things that no charter ever fully accounts for. About 6 weeks after the revised compact passed, I received a formal invitation to attend a senior, consultative dinner hosted by the VETH delegation. That may not sound remarkable, that in practice, it was for decades, those dinners have been one of the places where real alignment happened before official alignment. Not always, not completely, but often enough that being invited mattered. Earth had never been invited before that I considered declining. Not because I was offended, because invitations are statements, and accepting them is also a statement. The room I had built my position from was the outer ring, the edges, the places overlooked by the center. There is always danger in being welcomed too quickly by the people who had once preferred you quiet. But after thinking it through, I accepted. Refusing would have been theatrically satisfying and strategically foolish. The dinner was held in a private reception chamber inside the VETH diplomatic wing. The room was larger than my quarters and warmer than most station spaces, designed for species who preferred heavier gravity and denser atmosphere. The lighting was low and amber. The table itself was curved rather than straight, which I suspected was meant to suggest equality while still preserving hierarchy by placement. There were 9 attendees. Breath, of course, that a Solon commercial minister, whose attendance was more interesting than anyone pretended, that a Durac legal observer, .2 representatives from smaller allied worlds, myself. and 3 others whose presence told me this was less a dinner than an assessment. The food was terrible, not objectively, perhaps. To the species present, it may have been exquisite. But for me, it involved a series of textures I would rather not describe in detail and a drink with a metallic aftertaste that clung to the back of the throat like regret. I ate enough to be polite. Then I listened. That was still, even now, my strongest habit. People speak differently when they believe they are returning to a familiar kind of room. The powerful especially, they relax into old assumptions. They expect the pace to favor them. They assume the terms of seriousness belong to their style of conversation. In that setting, if you remain still and let people underestimate how much attention you are paying, they often tell you more than they intend. Nothing dramatic was said that night. No confessions. No threats. No secret offers wrapped in obvious language. What I learned instead was subtler, and, because of that, more useful. The Veth were already thinking beyond the compact, over the Solon. There were early conversations happening around shipping access, committee balance, expansion forecasting, and whether the new consultation mechanisms could be guided in ways that appeared inclusive while remaining manageable. Manageable. That word came up 3 times, different speakers, different contexts. Same instinct. IT told me that the major powers had accepted the change in the room, but only to a point. They were already trying to understand how to live with the new machinery without truly surrendering control of its long-term direction. That was expected. That was politics. An O system yields simply because you prove it can move. The people who benefited most from its old arrangement immediately began looking for ways to shape the new one. That I went back to my quarters that night and wrote for nearly 2 hours. Not because the dinner had gone badly, because it had gone exactly as I expected. And that confirms something important. The first battle had been about access. The next would be about interpretation. That is how institutional power often survives defeat. If it cannot stop the new rule from existing, it works very hard to define what the new rule means. I had no intention of letting that happen uncontested. Around that same time, the developing world share was open for its first rotation process. There were more eligible worlds than the major powers had expected and more coordination among them than they found comfortable. For weeks, there were quiet conversations about who should hold the seat first. Earth was technically eligible, but I removed us from consideration immediately. That surprised people. Oliver called within an hour of hearing about it. You withdrew? Yes. Why? Because if Earth takes the first chair, I said, then everyone who was suspicious of the reform will decide they were right. It will look like I built a mechanism for myself and decorated it with principles afterward. There was a pause. That is annoyingly sensible, Oliver said. I know. Do you at least have a preference for who gets it? Yes. And the Droven. He thought about that. Why them? Because they are competent, under-recognized, and technically serious. They will treat the position like infrastructure instead of performance. Also, appointing them makes it harder for anyone to claim the seat is symbolic. Oliver sighed. Sometimes, he said, I genuinely do not know whether you are 31 years old or about 112. That seems healthy for diplomacy. The Droven won the chair, not by accident that I did not openly campaign. That would have weakened them. Instead, I made sure the right worlds had the right conversations early enough that by the time the formal process began, the result felt less like a victory and more like an obvious answer. That is often the cleanest kind of political success, the kind no one can point to and say, that was the exact moment someone forced this. The Droven took the seat and immediately began doing exactly what I'd hoped they would do. They worked no speeches, no symbolic drama, just technical review, procedural clarity, and stubborn competence. That IT was perfect. The major powers found it much harder to object to competence than they did to rhetoric. Months passed, then more. Nexus Station developed a new rhythm around me, or perhaps I developed one around it. There were still tense days, still moments when an old power would test boundaries. Still proposals that arrived dressed in neutral language while hiding very familiar instincts underneath. Still conversations where I could feel centuries of hierarchy trying to settle back into place like dust. But there were other moments too. better ones that a transit world I had never spoken to before, citing the consultation framework to demand an earlier seat in a negotiation, that a legal clerk from a minor delegation sending me a note to say that their ambassador had finally read the founding appendices after hearing what Earth had done and had found two procedural rights their world had never once used, at a committee session in which one of the older member powers stopped mid-sentence, rechecked a clause, and corrected themselves before someone from the outer delegations had to do it for them. These were small things, very small, and headlines and dramatic records. But systems are made of repeated small behaviors. Change those, and eventually larger things begin to follow. Point one evening, late, after a long day of consultations, I found myself walking alone through one of the observation corridors on the station's outer ring. That IT was one of my favorite places on Nexus Station. Most people preferred the busier interior sections with their light, noise, and constant movement. I liked the quieter edges. Long curved corridors with wide viewports looking out into the dark between stars. You could think there. You could also remember scale. That helps. Politics, especially at high levels, has a way of making every issue feel total while you are inside it. Every conflict becomes the center of reality. Every procedural fight starts to sound like the most important thing in existence. Then you look out at deep space and remember that the universe is very large, and most of it has never heard of your committee dispute. That does not make the dispute meaningless. IT just returns it to proportion. I stood there for a long while with my hand behind my back, looking out into the dark. At some point, I heard footsteps behind me. Light ones, measured as I turned and saw Counselor Air. Of all the people on the station, he was the least surprising person to meet in a quiet place at an odd hour. He inclined his head. Ambassador Voss. Counselor. He came to stand beside me at the viewport. For a little while, we said nothing. The stars did not move. Or rather, they moved in the vast, slow way things do when distance is too large for the eye to easily register change. Eventually, Air said, "Your world has become disgust." I laughed softly. That is one word for it. He made the small sound that, from him, might have been amusement. Among the older members, he continued, there are differing opinions. I had assumed. Some believe humanity is impulsive. That is also fair. Some believe humanity is dangerous. I thought about the notebook, the clause, the compact, the coalition, the quiet conversations, the wrong chair. Also fair, I said. He folded his thin hands before him. And some, he said, believe humanity may be useful in ways not yet fully understood. That interested me more. Do you? He did not answer immediately. The council, he said at last, has existed long enough to mistake endurance for wisdom on occasion. Worlds that arrive late sometimes see structural truths more clearly than those who helped build the structure and have become attached to its shape. I looked at him. That is a very elegant way of saying old institutions get used to themselves. Air's dry whisper almost warmed into humor. Yes, he said. That. We stood in silence again. Then he asked, do you intend to remain? It was an important question. Not politically, personally. Why first posting term had always been temporary on paper. Extensions were possible. Reassignment was possible too. Earth now had diplomats who would have volunteered eagerly for a seat at the council after seeing what the seat could mean. Before the last year, I had imagined I might want to go home as soon as my duty was complete, back to gravity that felt right. Air that belonged to my own world. Streets built by humans for humans. Tea that tasted like tea. But somewhere in the process of surviving the council, I had become part of it, not absorbed by it. That would have been a different, sadder thing to know. I had become one of the people altering its future in small, stubborn ways that is difficult to leave once you begin. For a while, I said. Air nodded slowly, as though that matches expectation. That seems wise. Does it? Yes, he said. The first person to open a door is rarely the best person to walk away from it immediately. That stayed with me, because he was right. Opening a door matters, but what matters next is what gets built through it, around it, after it. And those who open doors and leave too quickly often return to find that someone else has quietly built a wall in the GP.SOI stayed. Not forever, but long enough to help anchor the consultation framework into ordinary practice. long enough to see the second rotation of the developing world's chair completed without crisis, long enough to watch smaller worlds begin speaking a little earlier in meetings instead of waiting until decisions were almost closed, long enough to see Earth stop being described as probationary in tone even when no one used the word aloud, long enough to know the change was real. Years later, people would tell the story badly. They always do. That is another law of politics. Complicated things become simplified in memory because simplicity is easier to pass along. There would be versions where I was fearless, versions where the claws came to me in a flash of genius, versions where I outmaneuvered the council in a single perfect speech. None of that was true, that I was afraid often. The clause was found because I read everything. There was no single speech that changed the chamber. There were months of preparation, listening, note-taking, waiting, risk, compromise, and a great many conversations with people no one else had thought important enough to notice. That is the truth. Less dramatic, more useful. Because it means the lesson is not that history changes when extraordinary people perform miracles. The lesson is that systems, even very old ones, are usually more fragile and more flexible than they want you to believe. And if you are patient and observant and willing to do the boring work no one applauds, you can sometimes move things everyone else has mistaken for permanent. That was true of the council that IT is true of most things. And if I'm honest, that was what the smiling had always meant. Not certainty, not arrogance, recognition. The kind that arrives when you realize the room is full of locked doors, and then realize several of them are only stuck because no one has tried the handle in 4,000 years. That on my final night, before my first home leave to Earth, I returned to the convocation hall after the session ended. That IT was mostly dark. Only a few sections remained lit, enough for staff and late workers to cross safely. The great high ceiling disappeared into shadow. The cloud layer near the arches was thin that evening, almost invisible. The chamber felt larger when empty. Older 2. I walked to my seat. The same one at outer ring. Wrong height. Slightly too far back from the desk. That I stood there for a moment, looking at it. That I could have had it changed at any point. That I never did, partly out of habit, partly out of stubbornness, but mostly because I had come to understand that the wrong chair was not an insult anymore. That IT was evidence, proof of where I had started. Proof that power had not invited me inward before I made myself impossible to place at the edges. I put a hand on the back of the chair and looked out across the chamber toward the central podium. So much of history looks inevitable from a distance. That is one of its cleverest illusions. Looking backward, people draw straight lines where none existed. They make outcomes feel natural, obvious, meant to happen, but I knew how much of this had depended on timing, attention, courage, luck, and the willingness to keep going while afraid. I knew how close it had all come to failing. And because I knew that, I also knew something else. The future would not hold because of one victory. That IT would hold only if enough people kept paying attention, kept reading, kept asking the inconvenient question, kept speaking to those at the edges as though the edges were part of the structure and not decoration. Around the center. That work would continue after me. If I had done my job properly, it already had. I stood there in the quiet chamber for a long time. Then I turned off the lights in my section, the same small courtesy I had done before, and started walking toward the exit. My office was still small. My resources were still limited. Earth was still young by council standards, still inexperienced, still underestimated in some quarters and overfeared in others. Good. That meant there was still room to work. That I could see the chamber doors. I stopped and looked back once more at the dark curve of platforms, the impossible ceiling, the room that had once seemed built entirely for other species and other histories. Then I smiled, because somewhere behind me, in files and committees and habits and expectations, the shape of that room had changed, and somewhere far ahead, whether the council yet understood it or not, humanity was just getting started. Not bad, I thought, for the species with the wrong chair.